the burning heat of the Mesopotamian desert, one of Rome's most powerful men met a death so shocking that it haunted the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had built his immense fortune on the suffering of others. But in the end, it was greed itself that became his downfall. Gold, the very thing that had made him powerful, would be turned into the instrument of his horrific demise. The year was 53 BCE, and Rome's hunger for conquest was greater than ever. At that time, 3 men held the reins of power in an uneasy alliance: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his 2 allies carved their reputations through brilliant military victories, Crassus faced a humiliating reality. To most of Rome, he was little more than a banker standing beside warriors. His vast wealth, built through real estate deals, and the labor of countless slaves, gave him political influence but not the honor he desperately craved. Crassus had watched Caesar conquer Gaul and Pompey dominate the Mediterranean. Their names rang through Rome's marble halls, while his own accomplishments were seen as uninspiring. Being called the third wheel of the triumvirate cut him deeply, and the insult stayed with him. At 60 years old, most men would have chosen to retire in luxury, enjoying their riches. But for Crassus, wealth was no longer enough. He believed that only through military conquest could he achieve true glory and place his name beside Caesar and Pompey. The Parthian Empire became his target. Stretching from the Euphrates River to the Indus, it controlled the priceless trade, routes that carried silk and spices between east and west. To Crassus, conquering Parthia promised not only glory, but also unimaginable wealth, so much gold and silver that even his fortune would pale in comparison. The Roman Senate, wary of his ambitions, refused to give him the traditional declaration of war, but Crassus pressed forward anyway. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor and immediately began preparing for his grand invasion. Local commanders who knew Parthian tactics well warned him of the dangers. Crassus dismissed them as cowards. To him, every desert kingdom had eventually fallen before Rome's discipline and engineering. Why should Parthia be any different? His confidence grew when reports arrived of unrest within the Parthian royal court. To Crassus, it seemed like the perfect moment to strike, a chance to claim victory, glory, and even greater wealth. Crassus raised a massive army for his campaign, 7 legions totaling nearly 40,000 soldiers, supported by 4,000 cavalry and another 4,000 light infantry. It was one of the largest Roman expeditionary forces ever sent eastward. Among his officers was his beloved son Publius Crassus, a proven commander who had earned distinction fighting under Caesar in Gaul. The presence of his heir gave Crassus even greater determination. This war, he believed, would not just bring him personal glory, but would establish a lasting family legacy of military triumph. The invasion began in the spring of 53 BCE, when Roman forces crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma. At first, everything seemed to confirm Crassus's confidence. Local towns and villages surrendered quickly, or else fell easily to Roman siege engines. The flat plains of Mesopotamia looked perfect for Rome's heavy infantry tactics, and early, reports suggested that King Orodes II of Parthia was distracted by uprisings elsewhere in his realm, leaving the frontier poorly defended. But what looked like an easy advance was in fact a trap. Parthian strategy had been carefully planned by Serena, the young but brilliant commander of their forces. He deliberately lured the Romans deeper into the desert, stretching their supply lines thin and forcing them to march under brutal conditions. Small clashes were staged only to retreat quickly, giving Crassus the illusion of victory while gradually exhausting his men. As the legions moved further into the barren landscape, the true nature of their opponent became clear. The Parthians were nothing like the barbarians Roman propaganda had described. They were a disciplined, highly organized military power, with centuries of experience fighting in their homeland's harsh deserts. Their strength lay in mobility and ranged warfare. The core of their army consisted of 2 deadly forces. First, the cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry designed for devastating shock charges. Second, the famous horse archers, fast and relentless, able to fire with deadly accuracy from great distances while staying well out of reach of Roman infantry. Surina's tactics targeted every weakness of Roman warfare. The legions relied on tight formations and set-piece battles fought on clear terms. The Parthians refused to give them that fight. Instead, they emphasized speed, flexibility, and constant harassment. While the Romans marched in rigid order, the Parthians circled around them, striking again and again. Where Rome sought decisive engagement, Parthia was content to wear its enemy down, bleeding them slowly with endless skirmishes. By the time Crassus realized the danger, his army was already caught in the perfect trap. The Parthians also waged a form of psychological warfare that wore down the Romans day after day. Scouts would appear on distant ridges just close enough to be seen, then vanish before the legions could mount a pursuit. Supply convoys were suddenly attacked by unseen riders, who struck without warning and disappeared into the endless desert. At night, Roman sentries reported strange noises and movements beyond their camps. Soldiers grew restless, unable to sleep, until the entire army was drained, nervous, and increasingly paranoid. Crassus began to understand that his trusted Roman methods were failing in this new kind of war. His heavy infantry, so effective in the forests of Europe or along the Mediterranean coasts, struggled here under the punishing heat and shifting desert terrain. His cavalry force, small compared to his infantry, was inadequate for the fast-moving battles of the region. Even worse, his supply lines became easy prey for Parthian raiding parties that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The decisive moment came at Carrhae, a small city in northern Mesopotamia, where Crassus decided to take his stand. The ground around the settlement seemed to give him an advantage. Hills provided defensive positions for his infantry, and the nearby water supply meant his men would not suffer from thirst. Reports indicated that Surina's main force was approaching. To Crassus, this looked like the opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to win a decisive battle that would redeem his entire campaign and prove Roman supremacy once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began at dawn on June 9th, 53 B. The Roman army deployed in its traditional formation, heavy infantry packed tightly in the center, cavalry placed on both wings, and lighter troops screening the front. Crassus himself stood with the infantry at the center, while his son Publius commanded the cavalry on the right flank. Under the rising sun, the Roman legions looked magnificent, their standards raised high and polished armor shining. To all appearances, it was still the most formidable war machine of the ancient world. Then came Surina's army, and with it, a shocking demonstration of Parthian military brilliance. Instead of a fixed battle line, the Romans were met by a force unlike anything they had seen before, an army composed entirely of cavalry. The Parthian heavy cavalry, cataphracts clad from head to toe in steel-like armor, formed the core of the force, while thousands of horse archers flowed around them in constant motion. Their movements were so fluid and unpredictable that Roman commanders struggled to anticipate or counter them. The battlefield itself seemed to shift with every Parthian maneuver. The battle began with a thunderous storm of Parthian arrows that filled the sky and rained down on the Roman formation. Unlike other enemies who usually ran out of ammunition quickly, the Parthians had prepared supply wagons packed with endless arrows. Their horse archers were constantly resupplied, keeping up the bombardment without pause. Roman shields, built mainly to stop spears and swords, were no match for this relentless downpour. Hour after hour, the arrows cut into their ranks, breaking morale and slowly weakening the once solid Roman lines. Publius Crassus, young, brave, and eager to win glory, made a tragic mistake. Leading the Roman cavalry, he broke formation and charged directly at the Parthian center. It was exactly what Surina had planned. The Parthian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, absorbed the Roman charge with their armored wall, while swarms of horse archers encircled Publius and his men. Isolated from the main army, surrounded on all sides, his cavalry was destroyed piece by piece. The slaughter took place in full view of his father and the rest of the Roman legions. The fall of Publius marked the true turning point of the battle. Surena ordered his men to sever the young commander's head and raise it on a spear. They paraded it in front of the Roman lines, taunting the legionaries while Crassus looked on in disbelief and grief. The sight shattered his spirit. The man who had once marched so confidently across the Euphrates was gone, replaced by a broken figure who could barely issue clear orders. With their general crushed and morale collapsing, Roman discipline began to unravel. The legions realized the grim truth. They were stranded deep in enemy territory, outmaneuvered by an army that could attack whenever it wished while staying out of reach. Their water was running dangerously low, the wounded lay untended, and each attempt to break free only led to more casualties. What had once seemed like an open path to conquest had turned into a desert trap with no way out. As night fell, Crassus tried to organize a retreat toward the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping the narrow streets would give them cover against Parthian cavalry. But the retreat quickly descended into chaos. Exhausted and terrified, many Roman soldiers abandoned their weapons and formations, running in desperation to escape. Thousands were cut down in the darkness by pursuing horsemen, while others collapsed from exhaustion or heat and were left behind by comrades too weak to help them. The shattered remains of Rome's once mighty eastern army limped into Carrhae as dawn broke. Nearly half their soldiers had been lost in just one day of fighting. The proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates in confidence were now nothing more than a battered mob of survivors. Their battle standards were gone, their discipline destroyed, and their commander weighed down by grief and the crushing weight of failure. Crassus had sought the decisive battle he longed for, but its outcome was nothing short of disaster. Surinna, instead of immediately storming Carrhae to finish the Romans, chose a different approach. He sent envoys under flags of truce, offering to negotiate. The Parthians suggested that both commanders meet on neutral ground to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. On the surface, the proposal seemed reasonable. Both armies had endured losses, and the Parthians had already proven their superiority. For Crassus, clinging to any chance of saving the remnants of his force, the offer felt like hope. Perhaps he could preserve some honor, rescue part of his army, and return to Rome with at least a fragment of dignity intact. Despite warnings from his officers, who feared treachery, Crassus agreed to the meeting. His desperation to end the nightmare outweighed his judgment. He wanted to believe there was still a chance to negotiate an honorable settlement, that his bold gamble had not ended in total ruin. What happened next remains debated by ancient historians, but the result was undeniable. The meeting broke down in violence. Parthian troops seized control, overpowering the Roman delegation. Whether it was a planned betrayal or a breakdown of trust between both sides is unclear. What is certain is that Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, was now the prisoner of the very commander who had annihilated his army and taken his son's life. For the Parthians, this was no ordinary captive. To them, Crassus symbolized the arrogance and greed of Roman ambition. His invasion had not been provoked. It was not launched in defense, but purely out of hunger for wealth and glory. To Surinna and his men, Crassus was not just a defeated general. He embodied everything they despised about Rome's endless drive to conquer and dominate. The decision to execute Crassus in a way that reflected both his character and his crimes was no accident. For the Parthians, this was not only about justice, but also about sending a message. In their culture, honor was measured by deeds, not by wealth, and to them Crassus represented the worst of Roman values: greed, arrogance, and exploitation. His death needed to serve as a warning, not just to Rome, but to any future invader who thought Parthian lands could be taken easily. The method chosen was brutal, but deeply symbolic. Molten gold, the very metal that had defined Crassus's life and fueled his reckless invasion, would be the instrument of his end. Parthian craftsmen heated the gold until it became liquid, burning hot and deadly. The symbolism was clear. The man who worshipped wealth above all else would be destroyed by the very thing he had pursued so obsessively. The execution was carried out as a public event, witnessed by Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers. Crassus was forced to his knees, soldiers holding him in place so he could not resist or speak a final plea. Then, in front of the crowd, the molten gold was poured into his mouth. The suffering was unimaginable. Liquid metal, heated to over 1,900 degrees F, scorched through his mouth, throat, and internal organs while he remained conscious. But just as important as the pain was the symbolism. The mouth that had spoken endlessly of conquest and power was now silenced by the very wealth he had once worshipped. The throat that had carried his speeches of Roman greatness was destroyed by the substance he craved most. For witnesses, it was a grotesque but unforgettable display, a man consumed by the same gold he had valued more than human lives. His body, once surrounded by luxury, became a symbol of ruin, a warning to all who allowed greed and ambition to eclipse reason and honor. The death of Crassus sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. It was not just the loss of an army, but the destruction of one of Rome's most powerful men, killed in a way that perfectly reflected the emptiness of his ambition. The Parthians had not only defeated him on the battlefield, they had turned his downfall into a lesson that would echo for generations. News of Crassus's execution reached Rome within weeks, sending shockwaves through the city. Among the ruling class, fear spread quickly as they realized their eastern frontier was far from secure. The Parthians had not only defeated a Roman army, they had shown they were willing and able to deliver humiliating blows to Rome itself. The carefully built myth of Roman invincibility, strengthened through centuries of conquest, was shattered in the sands of Mesopotamia. The political consequences were immediate. The first triumvirate, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, was broken forever. With Crassus gone, the delicate balance of power collapsed. His enormous wealth and influence had kept Pompey and Caesar in uneasy partnership, but now the two surviving leaders were left as rivals. Their competition would soon spiral into open conflict, leading directly to civil war and the eventual fall of the Roman Republic. Ironically, in seeking glory and stability through Eastern conquest, Crassus had set in motion the very chaos he had hoped to avoid. For the Parthians, his execution and the treatment of prisoners were part of a larger strategy. While Crassus was killed in a highly symbolic manner, many surviving Roman soldiers were spared. Instead of execution, they were relocated to distant regions of the Parthian Empire, where they settled, raised families, and gradually blended into local communities. Their survival was meant to contrast with their commander's fate, mercy for ordinary soldiers who had followed orders, but destruction for the man whose greed had sparked the war. The symbolism of Crassus's death echoed far beyond the battlefield. Across the ancient world, writers, artists, and philosophers used his fate as a lesson. The image of molten gold being poured into the mouth of Rome's richest man became a lasting metaphor for the dangers of wealth, greed, and unchecked ambition. More than a century later, the historian Plutarch described it as a moral warning about how the pursuit of riches could corrupt and ultimately destroy a man. Modern scholars still debate whether molten gold was literally used in Crassus's execution, or whether the story was exaggerated for symbolic effect. But regardless of the exact details, the meaning was undeniable. The defeat at Carrhae marked a turning point in Rome's eastern ambitions. It showed that the empire's enemies could use psychological and symbolic warfare just as effectively as weapons on the battlefield. Even in death, Crassus was used to make a statement. Ancient accounts claim that his severed head was sent to the Parthian king Orodes II, where it was displayed during a theatrical performance mocking Rome's pride and ambition. For the Parthians, Crassus was more than a defeated enemy. He was proof that Rome's power could be broken and its arrogance humbled. Some ancient accounts claim that Parthian performers even used Crassus's severed head in stage plays, including productions of Euripides's Bacchae. In these performances, he was portrayed as the tragic figure whose boundless ambition had led directly to his downfall. For Parthian audiences, Rome's defeat became not only history, but also a form of public entertainment. Archaeological discoveries from the battlefield of Carrhae continue to reveal the scale of the disaster. Broken weapons, pieces of armor, and human remains tell the story of a professional Roman army that was not merely beaten, but systematically destroyed by an opponent who understood both military tactics and the psychological aspects of war. In the years that followed, Roman military manuals were rewritten to account for the lessons of Carrhae. Yet the damage to Rome's reputation was permanent. The empire had been shown to be vulnerable, and its aura of invincibility could never be fully restored. The death of Crassus influenced Roman policy for decades. Future leaders approached the eastern frontier with far more caution, treating Parthia not as a disorganized enemy, but as a sophisticated power with its own strong military traditions and effective strategies. Rome began to recognize that conquest alone was not enough. Diplomacy would also be necessary when dealing with civilizations of equal strength. The legacy of Marcus Crassus serves as a lasting warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition. His journey from wealthy businessman to disastrous general shows how personal flaws can ripple outward, shaping the fate of entire nations. The molten gold that ended his life became a lasting symbol of how the very things we pursue most passionately can, in the end, destroy us. Even in today's world, the lessons remain relevant. In an age where wealth, ambition, and power continue to drive global events, the fall of Crassus reminds us of the responsibilities that come with leadership. True power is not measured only by resources or victories, but by wisdom, restraint, and an understanding of consequences. The golden death of Rome's richest man still echoes across history, warning us of the price of greed and the danger of never knowing when to stop.